Hello, that's me. I just want to say that I'm delighted to be here in this beautiful city and particularly happy to be in a room with a live audience after all this time. After many Zoom talks, it's just wonderful to be able to see you. I wish I could see the other half of your faces. But this is very good. You also probably have figured out by now that I'm going to give this talk in English. That was not a random choice. I only speak English with any fluency, and so my high school English was not very good in high school, and it's probably not much better now. Science tells us that the universe runs toward disorder. According to the second law of thermodynamics, physical systems move from a state of high energy and order, low entropy, to states of lower energy and relative disorder, high entropy. At the beginning of the Big Bang, the universe had very low entropy, and since the Big Bang, it has been continually growing more dispersed. The movement from order to disorder involves a loss of energy, and the unceasing process of expanding entropy creates time's unbending arrow. Generally, this is a one-way process. Warm objects become cooler, and temperature does not normally move in the opposite direction. Similarly, ordered objects move toward disorder, and they tend not to go the other way. It's much easier to break an egg than to put one back together. The exception is life. Isn't that cute? Living systems take up energy to create more ordered states. Life is a hedge, if only a temporary one, against the progress of entropy. Living things take in energy to create more ordered systems, but the energy stored in the organism is less than the energy consumed to make it. As a result, life provides a local hedge against entropy, but does not stop the overall progress toward disorder. The extra energy needed to fuel all life on Earth comes, of course, from the sun. Among living things, animals have a greater ability to adapt to their current environments, like all living systems, if they are to survive, they must take in energy and avoid predators, injury, and other health threats. The requirements of feeding and protecting life create preference for order over chaos. In general, animals like having control over their environments, and when control is impossible, they want to know what's coming in the future. This preference for predictability was demonstrated in a classic experiment by Badia, Culbertson, and Harsh, who placed rats in a chamber like this one. There was a lever that the rat could push, and the bars of the grid floor could be charged to deliver electric shocks to the rat's feet. The experimenters arranged it so that if the rat did nothing, it would occasionally be exposed to brief, half-second-long electric shocks at random intervals. Alternatively, if the rat pressed a lever in the chamber, shock would still come randomly, but each shock was preceded by a warning tone. Finally, in exchange for the addition of a warning, the rats were forced to endure a longer period of shock. This slide shows a diagram of the procedure. I've greatly simplified the description of the experiment, but these are the critical features. The rat could choose to have brief shocks that came without warning, or longer shocks that were preceded by a tone. In this slide, I've pulled out just a small piece of the results of the experiment. 3 rats were tested in this condition, and they had a choice of a half-second-long unsignaled shock or signaled shocks that were 5 times as long, 2.5 seconds. As you can see, the rats showed a strong preference for the warning signal, even though they had to suffer through a much longer period of discomfort. In this case, the rats chose to spend between 80 and 90% of their time in the signaled condition. And in other conditions of the experiment, rats showed a preference for signal shocks that were 4 to 9 times as long as the shocks that came without warning. Why? Why did the rats find predictability so important? There are at least 2 obvious reasons. First, when they knew the shock was coming, the rats undoubtedly figured out how to prepare for it and minimize the pain. Second, the rats learned that when the tone was not sounding, they were safe. There was no reason to worry about the shock until the tone started to sound. When the shocks came without warning, there were no safe periods. Shocks could come at any moment. So knowing that the world was safe when the tone was not sounding was quite valuable. The experiment produced very dramatic results, but of course, we are no different from the rats. Actually, we are somewhat different from rats, but in this respect, we are not. Humans, too, want to know what's coming. And in the beginning, much of the world was a mystery. We were much like the rats in the unsignaled shock condition. All the extremes of weather happened without warning, and disease and medicine were poorly understood. In ancient times, there were no reliable ways to predict many of the most important events in life, but that did not prevent people from claiming they could do just that. People who specialized in divination, fortune-telling, prophesying, and forecasting had no shortage of customers. The yarrow sticks in this picture are associated with the I Ching, or Book of Changes, and were used in a Chinese system of fortune-telling that dates back to 1000 BCE. If the methods of fortune-telling were not part of the predominant religious system of the time, they were often criticized by the local elites. But throughout human civilization, street-level magicians, shamans, and soothsayers have offered their services to the public. In connection with the topic of this conference, it's interesting to note that many of the methods traditionally used to read the mysteries of the future involved random processes that were believed to reveal the will of the gods or foretell the future. In an effort to see beyond the veil of the present, ancient people tossed yarrow sticks, or in the case of augury, interpreted the patterns produced by birds in flight, or by running herds of horses. Fortune-telling is thought to be one of the early uses of dice, or the casting of lots, as well as the drawing of lots, as in a lottery. More recently, the future has been divined from scattered leaves of tea in the bottom of your teacup, or from the fall of tarot cards. It's probably not a coincidence that each of these methods is symbolic of the larger project of pulling meaning and predictability out of a world that often seems random and disordered. Today, scientific and economic developments have removed many of the threats of the past for many of us, if not all of us. We have a far better understanding of the weather, and for many people around the globe, starvation is no longer an abiding threat. But there are still many things we care about deeply, but cannot predict or control. Will I find love? Should I change careers? Will my favorite sports team win the championship? Psychics, astrologers, and fortune tellers can still be found on the street or on the internet. I took this picture in Mystic, Connecticut, which is just a few miles from where I live. And you can see fortune telling is still a business. Our aversion to randomness is not limited to unpredictable electric shocks and sudden illness. For many years, it was unclear whether humans were capable of behaving randomly. Early experimental attempts to get humans to produce random behavior often failed. For example, in one study, college students were asked to write a series of H's and T's that would simulate the sequence of heads and tails produced by flips of a coin. The students failed miserably. In general, knowing that heads and tails were equally probable, the students alternated heads and tails too frequently. And they failed to recognize that a genuinely random sequence of coin tosses will naturally produce some long strings of repeated heads or repeated tails. Eventually, psychologist Alan Nuringer mounted a more concerted effort to see whether humans could behave randomly. He placed college students at a computer keyboard and asked them to press the 1 and 2 keys as randomly as possible. As expected, the students initially failed at this task. However, in a second phase of the experiment, the computer gave them immediate feedback on their sequences of key presses, using several mathematical measures of randomness. The students were also told that if they met criterion on all of the measures of randomness, they would receive a financial bonus. You could think of this as an experiment that used American capitalism to solve a scientific problem. After extensive training at the computer keyboard, all the subjects learned to produce random sequences indistinguishable from a series of coin flips. Nuringer concluded that humans are not temperamentally incapable of random behavior. Instead, they could learn to behave randomly in order to meet the demands of the situation. This makes sense. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and although many environments require us to find predictable patterns and duplicate them, as when we learn to walk, drive, or sing, other contexts demand random, unpredictable behavior. I picked this guy on purpose. When tennis players decide where to place their serves in the opposing court, they will be more successful if they vary their placement in an unpredictable manner. An opponent who doesn't know where the next ball is going will be less effective. It is also true that many creative enterprises are more successful when ideas, plots, themes, and associations are varied. Humor requires surprise, and many creative processes often benefit from an injection of randomness. As a result, we are not averse to chance and variation in every context. But in most other situations, we prefer certainty and control. We want happy marriages, healthy children, and good jobs. As much as we try, we cannot be certain all these things will happen. Whenever we lack control over the events that mean the most to us, the circumstances are right for magical thinking and superstition. Superstition does not appeal to everyone. Cultural and family upbringing have an important influence on whether magical thinking is a viable option. But a substantial portion of the population in many areas of the world admit to being superstitious. In an effort to gain a sense of control, they consult astrologers, wear jewelry to protect them from the evil eye, or as in the case of Barack Obama, play basketball on election day in order to ensure a victory. Astrology remains one of the more popular superstitions worldwide. It is an ancient form of fortune-telling that is thought to have originated in Babylonia 4,000 years ago. I hope it's not a disappointment to anyone in this audience when I say that astrology has not stood up to scientific tests, and as a result, I consider it a superstition. Nonetheless, 4 millennia later, astrology remains very popular and is currently enjoying a renaissance. Purveyors of astrology have adapted it to the internet, and different zodiac systems have evolved in China, India, and the West. Thanks to the internet and mobile technology, astrology is a very lucrative business. If you search for the word astrology in the App Store of your iPhone, you will find page after page of apps ready to serve you. According to some press reports, many young people in the United States are turning to astrology. Our younger generation is less religious than their parents, and according to popular theory, they are turning to astrology as an alternative form of spirituality. Of course, the younger generation is also saturated with various forms of social media, and astrologers have been quick to employ Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and other things to reach their potential clients. Although there is no evidence that the stars have any influence on your personality or that astrologers can foretell the future, there is evidence that people seek out astrology as a means of coping with negative life events. A group of Finnish researchers surveyed people who were attending 3 kinds of adult education classes in Helsinki: German language classes, psychology classes, and astrology classes. The researchers found that compared to the psychology and German students, people attending astrology classes were more likely to have endured a recent life crisis, such as divorce, infidelity, onset of menopause, a child leaving home, loss of employment, or economic difficulties. Furthermore, even among the people taking German and psychology classes, interest in astrology was correlated with having experienced one of these life crises. Like other studies, the Finnish study showed that people often find astrology appealing when life is uncertain. And for those who are drawn to it, astrology may provide a way of coping with the unpredictable shocks of life. Among the more elaborate superstitions, I'm fascinated with the evil eye, le mauvais œil, correct? For those who are not familiar with it, the evil eye is an envy-based superstition based in the belief that someone who is in possession of the evil eye and is envious of your good fortune can do you harm merely by looking. Babies are much beloved, and as a result, they are often believed to be the target of attack. Many defenses against the evil eye have been developed, most of which involve either distracting the evil glance away from the target or reflecting the evil rays back at the attacker. The superstition is popular in wide swaths of the globe, including South Asia, the Middle East, the European continent, and Central and South America. However, growing up in the middle of the United States in a default Protestant family, I had never heard of it. I was well into my 50s and already studying superstition when a student from Peru told me about it. The evil eye superstition is popular in many places, but how it is practiced varies markedly with culture. In particular, the method of distraction is quite different. For example, South Asian families often put a smudge or mark on a baby's forehead or cheek, both to distract the attacker and to suggest that the baby has a blemish or an imperfection. Various forms of amulets are used as protection. The two items here on the right hang on my kitchen wall. The top one is the beautiful blue glass Turkish Nazar, and the lower one is the Hamsa, which is popular throughout the Middle East. Both can be hung in the home like this, or smaller versions are commonly used as jewelry. Other protective objects are used in Italy and in Central and South America. All of these objects have become popular fashion accessories. The profit motive has done much to sustain the popularity of many superstitions. Recent work in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology has shown that most of us are loss averse. A loss makes us feel bad more than an equivalent gain makes us feel good. It is no wonder that so many superstitions are fear-based, purporting to protect us from losses if we wear evil eye jewelry, stay away from the number 13, and avoid spilling the salt. Superstitions can be divided into two broad categories. Many superstitions are socially shared. Through socialization, we acquire them as part of our cultural or family knowledge. Both astrology and the evil eye fall into this group. Other superstitions are personal and unique to us. Few things could be more personal and specific than Barack Obama's need to play basketball on Election Day. It is noteworthy that the same talent for learning and association that has made us the most dominant species on the planet is also responsible for some irrational ideas. In the desperate search for a shred of additional control, we often see connections where there are none. For those who believe in luck, a concept quite different from randomness, they find it in random places. For example, some people adopt personal superstitions based on the coincidence of a happy outcome with a particular shirt, tie, bracelet, or pair of socks. A good performance in a job interview or a professional presentation leads to the discovery of a lucky sweater. In Barack Obama's case, the pattern was not hard to see. He organized a casual basketball game on the day of the 2008 Iowa caucus. This was his first primary election contest, and he won. The next primary election was in New Hampshire, and for whatever reason, he failed to organize a game. This time, Obama lost his primary to Hillary Clinton. From that point on, the superstition was locked in. And the picture on the previous slide was Obama playing basketball on November 4th, 2008, the day he became the first African-American elected president of the United States. To his credit, in the first volume of his autobiography, Obama calls this basketball ritual a superstition. Athletes are particularly prone to personal superstitions in the form of rituals that they execute before each match. Perhaps the classic example is tennis player Rafael Nadal. Do you know him? Those whose elaborate rituals before every serve are legendary. His routines are so lengthy and complicated that he sometimes irritates opponents and fans, and on occasion has been penalized for delaying play. I should point out that unlike Barack Obama, Nadal denies that he is superstitious. I'll let you decide whether he is or not. In some cases, the random connection that launches a superstition comes from a positive or negative auditory association. Two of the most common Chinese superstitions involved accidental associations with the numbers 4 and 8. 4 is an unlucky number in Chinese culture because when spoken, it sounds like the word for death. And when 8 is spoken, it sounds like the word for fortune or prosper. As a result, the number 4 in all its variations, 14, 44, etc., are avoided in the Chinese marketplace. A 2003 study of the prices of items advertised in newspapers from Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Taiwan found that prices ending in 4 were the least likely and prices ending in 8 were the most likely, accounting for approximately 40% of all items. All because of an accidental association with the sound of the words. Superstitions provide an illusion of control. Because there is no actual magic, I'm sorry about that, a superstition's benefit is primarily psychological. But in a random, uncontrolled world, that is often enough. Superstitions serve to lower anxiety, and in the case of athletes and other performers, they can fill the nervous moments before the match or performance begins. Although the effect of superstition is not magical, there has always been the possibility that the psychological benefits of superstition might lead to better performance on the playing field or on the stage. Unfortunately, at this moment, the research evidence is unclear. A study at the University of Cologne in 2010 seemed to show that superstition enhanced performance. In a famous experiment, the researchers invited university students into a laboratory to putt a golf ball into a cup. People were randomly assigned to one of two groups. For one group of students, the experimenter handed them a ball and said, "This ball has been lucky today." The other half of the group were merely told, "Here's your ball." The researchers had previously determined that approximately 80% of the study participants believed in luck. When they analyzed the results, the lucky ball group had significantly better rate of getting the golf ball into the cup. This appeared to be the first clear evidence that the psychological benefits of superstition could lead to better performance at a skilled activity. Unfortunately, this study was published at the beginning of what has come to be called the replication crisis in psychology. Researchers found that many classic studies that had been in the textbooks for years were difficult or impossible to reproduce. Perhaps because it received so much publicity, the golf ball study came to the attention of a group of researchers at Dominican University in the United States. The U.S. group staged a replication of the study with far more participants and better controls, but alas, they were unable to reproduce the lucky ball effect. Another study knocked down by the replication crisis. As a result, it still seems plausible that psychological benefits of superstition might produce better performance in sports or other skilled activities, but the evidence so far is unclear. The picture is brighter for rituals. A number of recent studies have shown that performing a symbolic, though not religious or explicitly superstitious, sequence of actions prior to a potentially stressful activity produced lower anxiety and better performance. In various studies, participants performed rituals prior to singing a song in front of strangers or performing timed math problems. And in these situations, rituals helped. The effect was not magical, but something about the meditative sequence of actions seemed to calm and focus the participants. Although we spend much of our time hoping to reduce uncertainty and increase control, there are some exceptions to that rule. A 2017 study of German citizens asked them the following questions, and you think about your own answers. I won't ask for a raise of hands, but you think about your own answers as you read them. Assume you are newly married. Would you want to know whether your marriage will end in divorce? Would you want to know today when you will die? Would you want to know from what cause you will die? You probably guessed it, but the number of people wanting to know the answer to these questions never reached 5%. Overwhelmingly, they preferred to remain ignorant. The German study involved hypothetical situations, but some real-world dilemmas create similar preferences for uncertainty. Huntington's disease is a genetic disorder that typically strikes when a person is between 30 and 50 years old, eventually producing involuntary bodily movements, dementia, and death. There is no cure. The American folk singer Woody Guthrie, who's shown on this slide, died of the disease. Because Huntington's is an autosomal dominant disorder, each child of an affected parent has a 50% chance of inheriting it. After scientists discovered a genetic test for Huntington's disease in the early 90s, a curious thing happened. When approached by agencies that could provide the test, very few people at risk for the disease asked to be tested. According to one report, fewer than 5% of people requested the test in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and the greatest number of tests requested was only 24% in the Netherlands. When there's nothing to be done and the news is potentially devastating, uncertainty leaves room for hope. So, can humans tolerate a random world? On the one hand, we have no choice. Random events are here to stay. We would love to have more predictability and control in our lives, but it is not always possible. Like the unfortunate experimental rats, the shocks are coming at us, and many of them will arrive without warning. Furthermore, in important ways, our survival depends on randomness and uncertainty. Thanks to science, we now have a much truer understanding of the human body, weather, and the universe. Yet success in science requires coming to terms with the unknown. It requires a temperament that psychologists call tolerance for ambiguity. If the explanation for a phenomenon is lacking, scientists are duty-bound to hold on to that uncertainty, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Seizing upon an explanation simply to fill a gap in understanding leads to error and false theories. As a result, our success at reducing uncertainty in the future depends in part on our ability to live with uncertainty now. In addition, like any creative activity, science depends on variation. We are all in this room today because of the remarkable success of the coronavirus vaccines, but many failed experiments were necessary before the right solution was found. Scientists must be courageous enough to try new things, be a little crazy, and fail often. Finally, natural selection, the process that brought humans to their dominant position on this planet, depends on random variation within generations combined with continuity across generations. Without random variation in traits and capabilities, a species could easily be wiped out by an inhospitable shift in its habitat. Variation within the species protects us from elimination by plague, temperature change, or other shifts in environment. So what's the answer to our question? Can humans tolerate a random world? Uncertainty is a problem for all of us. Most of the time, we would rather not have it. We want to know what's coming, and where possible, have control over it. But it is an ironic truth that to defeat uncertainty in the future and win our battle against entropy, we need to live with uncertainty in the present. Of that much, I am almost certain.
Thank you for your talk. Now, any question in English, please, because you.
I have a question. First, thanks for your conference. I have a question about the experiment where students were asked to predict a series of heads and tails. You said that their series were considered as not random enough because they had too many
Right.
HT sequences and not enough consecutive H's or T's. But if you do flip a coin, you might end up having HT more than consecutive H's or T's. So my question, although this is, you have a greater probability maybe of having consecutive H's or consecutive heads or tails, but my question is, were the students expected to give the most probable series of heads and tails, which would be then consecutive H's and consecutive tails? Well, more consecutive H's and tails. And if so, isn't this just erasing the randomness of flipping a coin?
If I understand your question, for any given sequence of any length, the probability of that should be 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5. But the fact of the matter is that the distribution does include longer sequences and also short ones. And so there is a tendency on the part of humans in many situations to think that a small sample of behavior will match the larger universe of what that behavior is, and that's a mistake. It happens in the case of sampling for a poll or for other things. And so this is essentially what the students did, is that they knew that it was 50-50, and they kept it at sort of 50-50 all the way through, rather than realizing that it's going to drift away from that and come back in the long run. And so I mean, that's a typical thing that has been found in many of these experiments. But they were able to, once they were given feedback, they were asked to, I didn't give a lot of details about that experiment, but they were asked to give a string, a relatively long string of responses. And then that string was analyzed by the computer, and then they got to try it again. And they sort of, by trial and error, figured out what was required to get the index to work. And so that's how the experiment was done.
In the Shakespeare theater, most of the characters are crazy, but the randomness, which means in Shakespeare theater the divination, is less crazy than the man and the character. Would you think sometimes that that divination on the irrationality could be less crazy and more rational than human beings? And in which case?
So, if I understand, I'm not sure I understand your question, but you're asking something about if divination, the randomness of divination, would be less crazy than, and I missed the second part of what. Then what? What's the comparison?
Than a random human being who is not totally fair in this
Yes.
means of thinking.
Certainly, some of these processes could very well be more purely random than a human can be, at least without training in this same way. No, that's very true. And it's interesting, one of the points that I didn't, it's not part of the talk really, but my understanding is that historically, there's a thought that we would have understood the laws of probability sooner if the dice that were made in ancient times were closer to being fair. But they were, they were off. And so they didn't produce a good random thing. But it's possible that some of these things, I mean, the yarrow sticks, the other kinds of methods are actually purer in terms of randomness than anything we can do. It's true. We are bound by other factors. So, good point.